The dining room was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversations about new cars, vacation homes, and successful business ventures. Linda May Parker sat quietly at the far end of the long oak table, her hands folded in her lap, the simple navy dress she had bought on clearance 3 years ago clinging a little too tightly at the waist. She was a math teacher at a middle school in Knoxville, Tennessee, a woman whose life was measured not in financial success but in the progress of her students. Tonight, however, none of that mattered. Her husband, Charles, Chuck to everyone in the family, leaned back in his chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand. His eyes slid toward Linda with the same look he had given her countless times before, a mixture of irritation and embarrassment. "You know, Mom," he said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "some men get wives who are their partners in success. Linda here insists on staying a schoolteacher, making what? 30,000 a year? Barely enough to keep gas in the car." The room chuckled politely, and Linda's face flushed crimson. She stared at the china plate in front of her, pushing peas around with her fork. His mother, Evelyn Parker, gave a sweet, poisonous smile as she reached for another serving of casserole. "He's not wrong, dear. You really should think about presenting yourself differently. A woman reflects her husband, after all. Look at Nicky Davenport, always polished, always at Charles's side when he goes to business functions." At the mention of Nicky, Linda's chest tightened. Everyone at the table knew who Nicky was, the young, glamorous owner of a chain of beauty salons downtown, often spotted on Chuck's arm at fundraisers and social events where Linda was no longer welcome. They didn't bother to hide the comparison. "I saw her just last week." One of Chuck's cousins chimed in. "Such style. She could open a magazine with those looks. And she helps out at Charles's networking events, right? That's what I call a supportive partner." Linda pressed her lips together, forcing herself not to respond. She thought of her students back at school, the way their eyes lit up when a difficult equation finally made sense, the pride in helping kids who had no one else cheering for them. But here, none of that counted. To them, she was just a frumpy teacher with an outdated haircut and a job that brought shame instead of status. Chuck leaned closer, his voice a hiss only she could hear. "You embarrass me. You don't dress like the other wives. You don't act like them. You're dragging me down." His breath smelled of whiskey, his eyes sharp as knives. By the time dessert was served, Linda felt like she had shrunk into nothing. The laughter around her seemed cruel, echoing in her ears. When Evelyn raised a toast to Charles's bright future and the family that supports him, Linda quietly set down her glass of water and prayed for the evening to end. The ride home was silent at first, the night outside the SUV filled with the orange glow of streetlights. Then Chuck slammed his hand against the steering wheel. "You sat there like a lump. Couldn't you at least try to keep up? Every wife in that room has a manicure, a personal trainer, some sense of style. And you, cheap dress, worn-out shoes. Do you even care how you make me look?" Linda turned her face toward the window, watching the blur of neon signs and fast food restaurants pass by. "I care about our son," she whispered. That only made him laugh harshly. "Maddie, don't get me started. That boy spends every waking hour with those damn robotics kits. He needs to be out on the football field, building strength, learning teamwork. Instead, he's tinkering with junk like some kind of mama's boy." Her heart lurched. "He's gifted," she said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "He builds machines most adults couldn't understand. He programs them himself. He has a future." Chuck's lip curled in disdain. "A future as what? Some nobody engineer? Football builds leaders. Robotics builds losers." The words slammed into her chest harder than a fist. She pressed her hand against her sternum, breath quickening, black spots flickering at the edges of her vision. "Chuck, I can't breathe." He shot her a glance, irritated. "Not this again. Always some drama when things get real." But before he could finish, Her body slumped sideways in the passenger seat. The world went dark for Linda. By the time the SUV screeched to a stop outside the emergency room, nurses were already rushing forward with a gurney. Chuck followed, his face tight, muttering about the inconvenience. Hypertensive crisis, one of the ER doctors said, quickly, checking her vitals. Severe stress. Get her on oxygen and start monitoring immediately. The bright hospital lights blurred above her as consciousness slipped away. And in that fading moment, all Linda could think was, have I wasted half my life with a man who despises me? The fluorescent lights of the ER cast a harsh glow over everything, from the gurney rolling down the corridor to the tired faces of the nurses moving quickly around her. Linda May Parker drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments of conversations. Blood pressure is sky high, someone said. Likely a hypertensive crisis. Get her stabilized. Another voice mentioned stress, exhaustion, too much strain on the heart. When she finally opened her eyes fully, she was in a private room, and 4 in her arm, the steady beep of a monitor beside her bed. A middle-aged physician in a white coat leaned over, his expression calm but serious. Mrs. Parker, your body is sending a warning. This episode was triggered by extreme stress. You need rest, and more than just a night or two. We're recommending a stress management program, maybe even a temporary stay at a wellness retreat in the Smoky Mountains. It will help you reset before something more serious happens. Linda nodded weakly, though her throat felt tight. She wanted to ask what would happen if she ignored the advice, but the look in the doctor's eyes told her the answer was nothing she wanted to hear. Chuck sat in a chair near the window, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up only when the doctor addressed him. She's going to be fine, the physician continued, but she cannot go back into the same level of stress immediately. That would be dangerous. Of course, Chuck said quickly, his tone polished, almost rehearsed. We'll do whatever it takes. He offered a tight smile, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. But as soon as the doctor left the room, the mask cracked. He checked his watch, let out a sigh, and muttered, You sure know how to pick your moments, Linda. I had 2 meetings today. Important ones. She looked at him from the bed, her face pale, her body heavy with fatigue. I didn't choose this, she whispered. He didn't respond, just stood and paced the room. After a while he added, Look, the doctor's right. You need a change of scenery. There's a wellness retreat near Gatlinburg. They've got yoga, meditation, all that stuff. A friend recommended it. I'll book you in for a few weeks. You'll rest, and I can handle things here. Linda knew exactly what that meant. He could handle Nikki, the woman who was slowly taking her place in every corner of his life. The thought of going away, leaving Maddie behind with Chuck and his disapproving grandmother, made her stomach knot. But her body felt so weak, so spent, that resisting seemed impossible. The next morning, nurses prepped her discharge papers. Chuck spoke with efficient detachment, arranging for her to be transferred directly to the retreat. To the doctors and staff, he looked like the dutiful husband, responsible, attentive, making all the right decisions. Only Linda could see the impatience behind his eyes, the eagerness to get back to his own life without the burden of her presence. 2 days later, Linda arrived at the retreat, nestled deep in the Smoky Mountains. The place was beautiful in a quiet, almost haunting way. Pine trees stretching toward the sky, mist curling over the hills at dawn, cabins scattered across a sprawling property. Inside, she was given a modest room with a view of the woods, daily schedules of guided relaxation, diet plans, and group sessions about stress management. At first, Linda tried to follow the program. She attended yoga, though her body ached and her mind wandered. She listened to lectures about work-life balance, about the importance of self-care, though each word felt like a reminder of how far she had fallen from the life she once imagined. The other guests smiled politely, shared their stories of burnout in corporate jobs, marital problems, empty nests. Linda nodded but said little. Her own pain felt sharper, deeper, as though it didn't belong in the same category as theirs. At night, she sat by the window of her cabin, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. Memories surfaced unbidden. Chuck's mocking laugh at the dinner table, his harsh words about Maddie, the smirk when he mentioned Nikki's name. She remembered their early years, too, how he once told her he admired her kindness, her devotion to children, her ability to see potential where others saw none. Back then, she had believed him. She had believed that love could endure differences, that kindness could bridge the gap between worlds. But sitting there in the silence of the retreat, she realized how wrong she had been. Love had faded long ago, eroded by disdain and betrayal. What remained was habit, fear of loneliness, and a desperate attempt to keep her family intact for Maddie's sake. A nurse stopped by each evening to check her vitals, reminding her to rest. Linda would smile, thank her, and then lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. She could no longer escape the truth. She was tethered to a man who did not love her, who saw her not as a partner but as a burden. And for the first time, she admitted to herself that she felt no love for him either. Only exhaustion, grief, and the hollow echo of years wasted. The mountains outside stood silent, ancient, and unmoved. Somewhere deep in her chest, something shifted. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest recognition that life could not continue this way. When Linda returned from the retreat several weeks later, the first thing she noticed was the silence in the apartment. It was too quiet, too empty. Her eyes darted around the living room, and her breath caught in her throat. The shelves where her books had once lined the wall were bare. The armchair where she used to sit and grade papers was gone. Even the family photos, wedding pictures, Maddie's school portraits had vanished, leaving pale rectangles on the walls like ghosts of a life erased. "Mom." Maddie rushed to her, his face pale, his small hands trembling as he clutched her coat sleeve. Dad kept moving things. He said they were just going into storage. But every day something else disappeared. First the TV, then your sewing machine, then the silverware. I didn't know what to do. She knelt down, holding him tightly, feeling the quick thump of his heart against hers. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though nothing felt okay. She looked around again, the hollowness of the apartment pressing in. What once was their home now felt like a stage, stripped bare after the show had ended. The sound of keys turning in the lock broke the stillness. Charles Parker walked in, the scent of cologne heavy in the air, his expression casual as though nothing unusual had happened. He carried a folder under his arm and tossed his jacket carelessly over a chair that wasn't even theirs anymore. "You're back," he said flatly. "Good. Saves me the trouble of tracking you down." Linda rose slowly, her body stiff. "What happened here? Where is everything?" "Streamlining," he replied without shame. "We don't need two of everything. Some of it's in storage. Some of it, well, Nikki and I can make better use of." The name hit her like a slap, though she had been expecting it. Nikki Davenport, the woman who had been lingering at the edges of her marriage for years, now stepping fully into the center. Charles opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "This is the divorce petition. I've already spoken with my attorney. Everything's straightforward. You'll sign where indicated." Maddie stood frozen, his wide eyes fixed on his father. "You're leaving us?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Charles didn't even glance at him. "Don't be dramatic. You'll still see me. We'll work out visitation. But Nikki and I are moving in together, and I won't have two households draining my finances." Linda's hands shook as she took the papers, scanning the cold legal language. The terms were as cruel as the tone in his voice. He was offering her a small apartment on the outskirts of Knoxville, a place barely large enough for two people, and minimal child support, not even enough to cover basic expenses. This isn't fair," she said softly, her throat dry. Charles smirked, pouring himself a drink from the half-empty bottle he kept by the counter. "Life's not fair, Linda. You've been coasting along, teaching your little classes, acting like that's enough. It's not. I'm moving forward and you're dead weight. Be grateful I'm giving you anything at all." Her face burned, but she forced herself to stay composed. Inside, her chest ached with grief and humiliation, but there was no point in begging. She had begged enough already, silently for years, for respect, for love, for some sign that their marriage still meant something. Maddie's voice cut through the tension. "I don't want to live with her. I want to stay with Mom." His small fists were clenched, his jaw set. Charles gave a dismissive wave. "You'll adjust. Nikki knows what's best for a boy your age. She'll get you into football, get you out of this nerd stuff with robots. You'll thank me later." Linda's heart broke for her son, but in that moment, clarity pierced through the haze of despair. This was the man she had tethered herself to for over a decade, a man who would dismantle her home, dismiss their child's passions, and replace his family without hesitation. She picked up the pen from the coffee table. Her hand wavered only once before she signed each line where the yellow tabs indicated. The scratch of ink on paper sounded final, like the closing of a door. Charles snatched the papers back with a satisfied smile. "Good. I'll have my lawyer file them by the end of the week. You can move into the new place by Monday. I'll have my assistant send you the address." He downed the rest of his drink and walked out as casually as he had entered, leaving behind only the echo of the closing door. Linda stood there, her son pressed against her side, the empty apartment yawning around them. Her hands were cold, but her voice was steady as she whispered, "We'll be okay, Maddie. We'll start over. Just you and me." The boy looked up at her, his eyes brimming with tears but also trust. And though her heart was breaking, Linda knew there was no turning back. She would not chase after Charles. She would not fight for a place in a life he had already given to someone else. She gathered what little was left, the few bags they had, the small things he hadn't taken, and held her son's hand tightly. Together, they stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the wreckage of a marriage that had died long before the papers made it official. The apartment Charles had arranged for them was a single-room unit in a tired complex on the outskirts of Knoxville. The walls were thin, the paint peeling in spots, and the faint odor of fried food lingered in the hallways. At night, Linda could hear the rumble of traffic from the interstate and the occasional shouting match from neighbors through the walls. The place had no balcony, no yard, only a narrow strip of pavement where children from the building played with battered bikes. Linda tried to smile for Maddie's sake as they carried in their meager belongings. She placed his robotics kits neatly by the window, hoping the light in the mornings might make the room feel brighter. But she could see the disappointment in his eyes. He had gone from having a small room of his own to sleeping in the same space as his mother, their beds divided only by a thin curtain Linda rigged from an old sheet. At his new school, Maddie struggled to fit in. The kids noticed immediately that he wasn't like them. He didn't care about football or video games. His joy was in the circuits and wires of his robotics projects, which earned him teasing and, worse, indifference. One afternoon, he came home sullen, his backpack dragging along the ground. "They said I had to join football practice," he muttered. "Coach told me robotics isn't a real club here. He said football builds character." Linda's stomach knotted. "You don't have to give up what you love," she assured him. But the pain in his face told her he already felt like an outsider. Meanwhile, her own world was collapsing under a different weight. She had managed to keep her teaching job, but the environment at the school had shifted. The new principal, a man named Mr. Grant, carried himself like a businessman rather than an educator. He made it clear at a staff meeting that results mattered, not the integrity of the process. Linda soon learned what he meant. One day, he called her into his office, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. "Mrs. Parker, some of our parents make generous contributions to ensure their children succeed. I expect my staff to cooperate. That means a little flexibility with grades. Do you understand?" Linda's heart sank. "You're asking me to take bribes," she said plainly. His smile never wavered. "I'm asking you to be a team player. Everyone else manages. Don't be the one who causes trouble." She shook her head. "I became a teacher to help children learn, not to sell them grades. I won't do it." The air in the room turned cold. His eyes narrowed. "Then you'll find life here very difficult." And he kept his word. Within weeks, her schedule was overloaded. She was assigned extra classes without additional pay, required to cover for absent colleagues, and handed stacks of paperwork that no one else seemed to touch. She stayed late almost every night, returning home exhausted, her voice hoarse from teaching, her fingers ink-stained from grading. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Rent, utilities, groceries. The child support Charles had promised barely covered half of what Maddie needed. More than once, Linda skipped meals so her son could have enough. She sewed a tear in his sneakers, rather than admit she couldn't afford new ones. At night, when Maddie was asleep, she would sit by the single window, staring out at the neon glow of a gas station sign across the street. The world outside felt harsh and different. She thought of the home she had lost, the marriage that had crumbled, the career she had believed in now tainted by corruption. Every corner of her life seemed to be closing in. Loneliness pressed down on her chest as heavily as the financial strain. Friends from her old neighborhood had drifted away, uncomfortable with her divorce or too busy with their own lives. Family was far, scattered across states, and phone calls only emphasized the distance. Sometimes she pressed her hands to her face, stifling sobs so Maddie wouldn't hear. Other times she sat in silence, the weight of despair heavy in her bones. She wondered how long she could keep fighting. She had always believed that if she worked hard, stayed honest, and gave love freely, the world would repay her in kind. But now, with her marriage gone, her job poisoned, and her son struggling, that belief felt like another piece of innocence she had lost. Still, every morning, she forced herself to rise, dress, and face the classroom. She looked into the eyes of her students and pretended she was steady, that she could still be the teacher they needed. She smiled at Maddie, even when her heart was breaking. Yet, deep down, Linda felt she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her. And she knew, though she couldn't yet imagine how, that something had to change, because if it didn't, she and her son would be swallowed whole. The phone rang on a Thursday evening as Linda sat at the kitchen table. A stack of unpaid bills spread before her. She picked up, and before she could even say hello, Charles's voice cut through the line, sharp and impatient. "I'm cutting the support," he said flatly. "You'll get less starting next month." Her stomach tightened. "You can't just decide that, Chuck." The court ordered. "I can decide plenty," he interrupted. "And if you push back, I'll take you to court myself." "You think you'll win custody? With your tiny apartment, your pathetic salary?" "Judges don't hand kids to mothers who can't provide stability. Nicky and I can give him a real home, a real future. Don't test me." Linda's hand trembled as she held the phone. She could hear clinking glasses and muffled laughter in the background, the sound of Nicky's world spilling into her ear. She wanted to scream, to tell him he had already taken enough, but her voice came out as a whisper. "He's our son, Chuck. He needs me." "Then figure out how to make it work," he snapped, and the line went dead. Linda sat frozen, staring at the bills that seemed to mock her. Rent, utilities, groceries. The numbers blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She pressed her palms against her face, trying to steady her breath, but the hopelessness pressed harder than ever. The next day at school, things got worse. Mr. Grant, the principal, summoned her to his office again. His desk gleamed with new fixtures, a leather chair, a polished nameplate, all symbols of the donations he siphoned from desperate parents. "Mrs. Parker," he began, folding his hands neatly, "it's clear you're not fitting into our system here. You refuse to cooperate, and frankly, your attitude is disruptive. I think it's best you hand in your resignation before the board forces the issue." Linda's pulse raced. I've given everything to this job. I've done nothing wrong. He smiled, a thin, cutting smile. Sometimes doing nothing is the problem. Write the letter, or the board will make a spectacle of it, and then good luck finding work anywhere else. She walked out of his office with her head held high, but inside she felt hollow. By the time she reached her apartment that night, she collapsed onto the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. The thought pressed down on her. She was losing everything: her marriage, her stability, her career. It was in that pit of despair that her phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was calm, professional. Mrs. Parker? My name is James Whitfield. I'm a probate attorney, calling from Sevier County. I'm reaching out regarding the estate of your late relative, Miss Eleanor May Carter. Linda blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. I don't know anyone by that name. She was a distant cousin, technically, the man explained. Lived in the Appalachian Mountains near Townsend. A very private woman. She passed away recently, and according to her will, you are listed as the primary heir. Linda laughed nervously. This sounds like one of those scams. What's next? You'll ask me to wire money to unlock it. I assure you this is no scam, the attorney said patiently. You don't have to send a cent, but you do need to meet with me to review the documents. Miss Carter has left behind a house, land, a vehicle, and additional assets. There is, however, one stipulation. To claim full ownership, you must reside in the house for at least 1 year. Linda sat up slowly, the words sinking in like stones dropping into water. A house, land, a car. It felt absurd, impossible. Why me? She asked quietly. Miss Carter had no children, no spouse, and few remaining relatives. Your name was specifically chosen. She ended the call in a daze, staring at the dim glow of the kitchen lamp. Her first instinct was disbelief. This had to be a mistake. She barely had enough left in her to believe in anything good. But the attorney's steady voice echoed in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. Later, when she explained it to Maddie, his eyes lit up for the first time in weeks. A house in the mountains? Really, Mom? Maybe it'll be like an adventure. Linda managed a small smile, though her hands were still shaking. Maybe it was an adventure, or maybe it was another cruel twist of fate. She didn't know. But for the first time in months, a fragile thread of possibility stirred inside her chest. The road wound higher into the Appalachian Mountains, each turn revealing slopes thick with trees still heavy from summer. Linda gripped the steering wheel of the borrowed sedan, her heart pounding as the small town finally came into view. Townsend was a quiet place, one main street lined with diners, hardware stores, and a few antique shops. Beyond it, the road narrowed until it gave way to a dirt drive that stretched into the woods. At the end of that drive stood the house. Linda stopped the car and stared, unable to speak. It was larger than she had imagined. An old southern estate, its wide porch wrapped around the front, white paint weathered to a soft gray. Vines climbed the railings, and the windows glimmered faintly in the fading afternoon light. It was old, yes, but it was beautiful. Maddie scrambled out of the car, his sneakers crunching on gravel. Mom, look, it's huge. He dashed up the steps and tugged at the heavy oak door until it swung open with a groan. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, but the space was breathtaking. The front room stretched wide, with a fireplace framed by carved stone and a chandelier that looked like it had hung there since the Civil War. Beyond it was a library, shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, lined with books bound in cracked leather and cloth. Linda wandered from room to room, awe and disbelief washing over her. The dining room still held a long mahogany table, its surface gleaming under layers of polish. Upstairs, she found a nursery-like room, but not for babies. This room was filled with model kits, robotic sets, and shelves stacked with manuals. Maddie stood in the center of it, his face glowing. It's like it was made for me, he whispered, already pulling down a box of gears and wires. Linda's throat tightened. She touched the edge of a workbench, running her fingers over initials carved into the wood. Whoever Eleanor May Carter had been. She had thought of children like Maddie, curious, inventive, searching for worlds they could build with their hands. That evening, after they unloaded what little they had brought, a knock came at the door. A gray-haired man in work boots and overalls stood there, holding his cap respectfully. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Name's Edward Collins, but folks call me Ed. I looked after this place for Miss Eleanor before she passed. Fixed the roof, kept the pipes from freezing. Figured I'd come by, see if you needed anything." Linda thanked him warmly, grateful for the kindness. He stepped inside briefly, his eyes scanning the rooms with a mixture of nostalgia and caution. "This house, it carries a lot of history," he murmured. "People say there's more buried here than books and furniture. Some still whisper about Confederate gold, hidden when soldiers passed through these hills." Miss Eleanor never said much, but she hinted now and then. Linda felt a shiver, half from the cool air drifting through the old windows, half from the weight of his words. The next day, while exploring town, she encountered another visitor at the property. A tall man in a tailored suit stood by the gate, clipboard in hand. His truck bore the name of a development company. "You must be Mrs. Parker," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "Name's Eldon Reeves. I run Mountain View Development. We've had our eyes on this land for some time. Prime spot for vacation rentals. I'd be happy to make you a generous offer." Linda shook her head. "The house isn't for sale." Eldon's smile tightened. "I understand it might be overwhelming for someone in your situation. Big place, a lot of upkeep. Think about it. I'll be in touch." He tipped his hat and left, but not before giving the property one last, lingering look. That evening, Linda sat on the porch as Maddie tinkered happily upstairs. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. She thought about the will, the condition that she live here for a year. At first, it had felt impossible. Now, as she looked at the house glowing softly in the twilight, it felt like the only choice she had left. She whispered to herself, "Steady and resolute, we'll stay. We'll make this work." For the first time in months, Linda felt a glimmer of peace. The house was old, perhaps even burdened with secrets, but it was theirs. And for a woman who had lost everything, that was enough to begin again. Within a week of settling into the old house, Linda began searching for steady work. The money left in her bank account would barely cover groceries, and though the estate offered shelter, she still needed income. She walked into the small-town high school, resume in hand, her nerves taut as she waited outside the principal's office. To her surprise, the interview was brief and almost warm. The school had been struggling to find qualified math teachers, and Linda's experience was exactly what they needed. By the following Monday, she was standing in front of a classroom again, this time with a better salary and a lighter schedule than she'd endured back in Knoxville. The difference was immediate. Here, the students were respectful, curious, and eager to learn. Teachers supported one another instead of competing, and the principal actually encouraged innovation rather than bribes. Linda walked home each day feeling lighter, almost hopeful, as if her profession had been restored to what it was meant to be. At home, Maddie was thriving in his own way. For the first time, he had a room filled with light, shelves lined with books and robotics kits left behind by Eleanor. He spent hours at the workbench, soldering circuits and sketching designs, his laughter echoing through the halls of the old house. When he proudly showed Linda a small robot he had programmed to follow voice commands, she felt a swell of pride she hadn't known in years. Slowly, the two of them began to weave themselves into the fabric of the town. Neighbors stopped by with pies or fresh vegetables from their gardens, eager to welcome them. The pastor at the local church introduced himself and offered help if they ever needed it. At the grocery store, the cashier asked how they were settling in, genuinely interested in the answer. For Linda, it was startling. She had grown so used to cold shoulders and judgmental stares in Knoxville that this kindness felt almost unreal. She began to exhale the tension she had carried for so long, allowing herself to believe that maybe she and Maddie could truly build a life here. But the shadow was never far away. Eldon Reeves appeared at the gate one crisp morning, leaning casually against his truck as if he owned the place already. "Mrs. Parker," he said smoothly, "I hear you've taken a position at the school." "That's good. But let's be honest, this house is a burden. It's old, it's expensive to maintain, and the land is unstable. Geological surveys have flagged this area for potential landslides. You and your boy don't want to be caught in that, do you?" Linda tightened her grip on the basket of groceries she was carrying. "We're not selling, Mr. Reeves. The house was entrusted to me, and I plan to honor that." His smile was practiced, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Think about it. You don't want to end up with nothing because you clung to a sinking ship." He left after a few more pointed remarks, but Linda couldn't shake the unease his words left behind. That evening, after Maddie had gone to bed, she wandered into the library. The shelves smelled of age and dust, and as she ran her fingers along the spines of books, she found something she hadn't noticed before: a leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of encyclopedias. It belonged to Eleanor May Carter. The handwriting inside was neat but faded, entries spanning decades. Some were mundane, notes about weather, garden harvest, repairs to the house. But others were different. They spoke of rumors passed down through generations, of gold hidden during the Civil War, of men who came sniffing around the property, claiming rights to it. There were even sketches, rough maps of the land, marked with cryptic symbols. Linda's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. The stories Ed, the caretaker, had hinted at were here in black and white. And the more she read, the clearer it became. Eleanor had known the property held more than sentimental value. She had guarded it fiercely, keeping the truth from opportunists like Eldon Reeves. Sitting at the old desk with the journal open before her, Linda felt a stirring she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, though danger lurked at the edges of these discoveries, but resolve. If Eleanor had trusted her with this house, then perhaps it was also her responsibility to protect whatever secrets it contained. She closed the book gently, the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Outside, the mountains loomed in the moonlight, silent witnesses to centuries of whispered legends. And Linda realized that her fight for survival was no longer just about rent or child support. It was about defending a legacy and perhaps uncovering a truth that others had been hunting for generations. The more Linda read through Eleanor's journals, the more unsettling the entries became. Early pages described everyday life: teaching Sunday school, tending gardens, walking into town for groceries. But as she reached the later volumes, the tone darkened. There were repeated mentions of strangers knocking at the door, questions about the property, men who offered money in exchange for quiet access to the land. One name surfaced more than once: Eldon Reeves. The careful script underlined it, as if to emphasize caution. Do not trust him. He's after what lies beneath. And then came the entry that froze Linda's blood. The Carter family guarded something since the days of the war: Confederate treasure, hidden when Union troops swept through these mountains. I never told a soul, but the hunters suspect. If they find it, they will not stop at words. They will destroy to claim it. Linda shut the journal, her pulse racing. She sat back in the worn leather chair, the shadows of the library thickening as the evening sun disappeared behind the ridges. Confederate treasure? It sounded like folklore, the kind of story passed around campfires to entertain children. Yet Eleanor had written about it as fact, with a seriousness that left no doubt. That night, sleep refused to come. She tossed in her bed, the sound of crickets outside only heightening her awareness of every creak in the old house. Around midnight, she heard it, footsteps crunching softly on gravel outside. She slipped quietly from the bed, her heart hammering, and pulled aside the curtain. The yard was drenched in moonlight, silver against the dark woods. And there, by the edge of the porch, a shadow moved, tall, deliberate. She held her breath as the figure crept closer, pausing at the window before melting back into the trees. By morning, she was still shaken. When Ed stopped by to drop off firewood, she pulled him aside. "Ed, have you ever seen anyone prowling around here at night?" His face tightened. "I was hoping you wouldn't. Eldon's been sniffing around this place for years. Back when Miss Eleanor was alive, he'd show up uninvited, asking about old family rumors. Folks say he's a treasure hunter, dresses himself up as a developer, but what he wants is buried under this land." Linda shivered. Eleanor warned about him in her journals. Ed nodded grimly. Then she knew what she was talking about. "Don't trust him, Mrs. Parker. Not for a second." Later that afternoon, while Linda was reorganizing books in the library, Matty came rushing in, his face flushed with excitement. In his hands was an envelope, yellowed with age, that had slipped from a false back in one of the shelves. "Mom, look what I found!" he exclaimed, spreading the contents across the desk. It was a folded piece of parchment, brittle at the edges, covered in hand-drawn markings. Linda leaned closer, her breath catching. It was a map, detailed sketches of the property, with symbols that matched those in Eleanor's journal. Lines traced from the house to the woods, ending at an X near a stone formation she recognized from their walks. "This is it," Matty whispered. "The treasure. It's real." Linda's throat went dry. She wanted to tell him not to get carried away, that legends didn't always hold truth. But the evidence was before her eyes. The map, the notes, Eleanor's warnings. She folded the parchment carefully and locked it back in the desk drawer, her hands trembling. "Listen to me, Matty," she said softly. "Whatever this is, it's dangerous. People like Reeves won't stop if they think we know more than we should. We need to be careful." He nodded reluctantly, though his eyes still shone with curiosity. That night, Linda lay awake once more, the journal open on the nightstand beside her. The house creaked as it settled, and every sound set her nerves on edge. She couldn't escape the feeling that inheriting this place had pulled her into something larger, something darker than she had ever imagined. She stared out at the moonlit ridges, her mind racing. This wasn't just a chance at a new life. It was a responsibility, one that came with danger, secrets, and the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. For the first time, Linda understood that Eleanor hadn't simply left her a house. She had left her a battle. The knock at the door came early on a Tuesday morning. Linda opened it to find Eldon Reeves standing tall on the porch, flanked by two men in pressed suits. One wore the badge of the county commissioner. The other carried a thick folder stuffed with papers. "Mrs. Parker," Reeves began smoothly, his voice edged with false courtesy, "we need to have a serious discussion about this property. The county has reviewed the geological surveys, and the risk of landslides is significant. For your safety and your boys', it would be best if you sold the land to Mountain View Development immediately." Linda steadied herself against the doorframe, her knuckles white. "This house has stood for over a century. If it were as dangerous as you claim, Eleanor would have been gone long ago." The commissioner cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're prepared to issue a notice of condemnation. You'll be forced out sooner or later. Selling now is your best option." Eldon leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You don't want to get caught up in legal trouble, Mrs. Parker. Sign the papers, take the money, and walk away." Linda forced a polite smile, hiding the tremor in her chest. "I'll need time to review these documents with my attorney," she said, deliberately using the word that made Reeves's jaw twitch. She accepted the folder, thanked them curtly, and shut the door. When she turned, Matty was standing at the foot of the stairs, worry etched across his face. "They want to take it, don't they?" She pulled him close, smoothing his hair. "They won't. Not if we can prove the truth." That evening, While sorting through boxes in the cellar, Maddie noticed something unusual. The floorboards near the back wall felt uneven, almost hollow beneath his sneakers. Excited, he called for his mother. Together, they pried loose the warped planks, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. Flashlight in hand, Linda descended cautiously. The air grew damp and cool, the stone walls glistening with moisture. At the bottom lay a hidden chamber, untouched for decades. Dust-covered crates lined the walls. Inside were relics, Confederate-era uniforms, rusted weapons, and bundles of yellowed papers sealed in wax. One trunk contained ledgers, maps, and a diary from a Carter ancestor who had lived through the Civil War. The entries detailed how the family had safeguarded not just rumors of treasure, but actual historical documents and artifacts too valuable to fall into enemy hands. Linda's hands trembled as she held up a ledger. This proves the family's legacy. This house isn't just old, it's a historic site. Maddie's eyes gleamed. If we show people, they can't take it away. Right, Mom? She nodded, determination replacing fear. Exactly. The next day, Linda contacted James Whitfield, the probate attorney. He examined the documents and agreed. What she had uncovered could change everything. At his suggestion, she reached out to the local paper, the Sevier County Gazette. Soon, a young journalist arrived, snapping photos of the artifacts, recording Linda's story, and promising an exposé that would make headlines. By the weekend, the front page carried the headline, "Hidden Confederate-era cache discovered in Carter Estate. Development plans questioned." The fallout was immediate. Residents who had once been indifferent now rallied around Linda, furious at the thought of losing a piece of their heritage. Calls flooded the county office, demanding an investigation. Cornered, Reeves tried to push back, insisting the artifacts were forgeries and the treasure nothing more than junk. But his own reputation worked against him. Whispers of his dealings, bribes, threats, shady land purchases surfaced quickly. Several townsfolk came forward with stories of how he had bullied elderly landowners into selling for pennies. Then came the final blow. A state investigator, alerted by the growing scandal, uncovered proof that Reeves had been involved in illegal artifact hunting for years. Photographs and records tied him to looted sites across Tennessee. By the time the county convened an emergency meeting, Reeves's polished veneer had crumbled. He stormed out of the hall, his face pale, while the commissioner who had stood beside him quietly distanced himself, promising cooperation with the state. Linda sat in the back of the meeting room, Maddie's small hand tucked in hers. She felt the weight on her chest lift for the first time in months. The house, Eleanor's house, now hers, was no longer a burden under threat. It was a treasure in its own right, recognized and protected by the very community Reeves had tried to manipulate. When they returned home that night, the mountains loomed dark and silent around them, but the house felt alive, glowing with new purpose. Linda paused on the porch, breathing in the cool air, her heart steady. For so long, she had felt powerless, tossed from one hardship to another. Now, standing in the place her family had entrusted to her, she realized she had done what she once thought impossible. She had defended her son's future, her legacy, and her dignity against those who would have taken it all. News of Eldon Reeves's downfall spread quickly across Sevier County. But for Linda, the true victory was far more personal. For months, her life had been dictated by other people's cruelty. Charles's betrayal, Mr. Grant's corruption, Reeves's greed. Now, at last, she could breathe. The legal process moved swiftly. With the support of the probate attorney and the mounting evidence of the Carter family's historical significance, the court recognized Linda as the rightful heir and granted her full ownership of the estate. The stipulation of living there for a year had been satisfied, but now the house was hers forever. No more threats, no more offers from men in suits. The title deed bore her name, Linda May Parker. At the same time, word about Maddie's talent began to circulate. The robotics kits Eleanor had left behind were more than toys. They became tools for a future. His small voice command robot drew attention at a local science fair, and within weeks a professor from the University of Tennessee reached out, inviting him to visit their engineering lab. Neighbors chipped in to buy him new supplies. Local businesses sponsored his projects, and for the first time, Maddie felt celebrated rather than ridiculed. Linda watched him bloom, his shoulders straighter, his laughter returning. He was no longer the boy mocked for being different. He was a young inventor whose community believed in him. Meanwhile, Charles Parker's carefully curated life collapsed. Nikki Davenport left him for a wealthier investor, and his business ventures, propped up more by image than substance, crumbled without her connections. He lost contracts, fell into debt, and eventually filed for bankruptcy. Rumors swirled that he had moved into a small rental outside Nashville, alone and bitter. He made no further attempts to interfere with Maddie's custody. Perhaps it was shame, perhaps exhaustion, but Linda suspected it was something simpler. He no longer had the resources to fight her. The man who once lorded power over her was reduced to nothing more than a shadow of his former self, irrelevant to the life she was building. For Linda, the sweetest revenge was not seeing him broken. It was realizing she no longer cared. His downfall had no hold on her heart. She had her son, her home, and her dignity. That was enough. Life at the estate settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with sunlight pouring through tall windows, Linda sipping coffee on the porch while Maddie worked in his workshop. Afternoons brought lessons at the school, where she was respected as both a teacher and a neighbor. Evenings often ended with visits from friends, Ed bringing fresh apples from his orchard, townsfolk stopping by to share stories or marvel at the artifacts Linda had carefully preserved in the library. She was no longer the frumpy wife mocked at dinner tables. In this community, she was a woman of integrity, someone who had stood her ground when others tried to tear her down. And in that recognition, Linda discovered a peace she had thought lost forever. One evening, as summer gave way to autumn, she and Maddie stood together on the wide porch. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine, and the mountains stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the amber glow of sunset. Maddie leaned against the railing, holding the small robot he had been working on all week. "Mom," he said softly, "do you think Dad ever wonders what he lost?" Linda looked out at the rolling hills, her heart steady. "Maybe. But what matters is what we've found." She wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. They stood in silence for a long while, the sound of crickets rising with the evening. For Linda, the moment held more weight than any courtroom ruling or newspaper article. It was the simple truth of survival, of finding strength when everything else had been stripped away. She had been humiliated, abandoned, nearly broken. But here, in the house entrusted to her, with her son by her side, she was whole again. The porch creaked gently beneath their feet as the last light of day slipped behind the ridges. And in that quiet, Linda felt certain. This was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new one built not on fear or loss, but on hope.